Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by Zach Cupples. Drawing from his experience as a physical therapist and strength coach in the National Basketball Association, Zach is a global load manager who advises athletes and organizations about all aspects of the performance continuum: rehabilitation, training, nutrition, sport science, sleep, stress management, and the learning process. Sometimes the simplest strategies can be the hardest to implement. Most people, regardless of their profession, are aware of how important sleep is for recovery and overall health. Yet despite this knowledge, many of us objectively perform worse because we're sleep deprived. Most people assume that professional athletes get enough sleep because it's their job to take care of their bodies. Professional sports is far from a greenhouse environment. Many logistical, financial, political, and behavioral considerations interfere with best practice. Zach provides great insight into how to do the basics in a very challenging and unforgiving work setting. Hey Zach, thanks so much for joining us. I wanted to get started by asking you a little bit about your background because you wrote an article that I thought was really insightful about how you've implemented some different sleep hygiene measures in the professional sports setting. But before we actually get into those specifics, I thought it would be good to just provide a little bit of context where maybe you could speak to some of the challenges of working in pro sports. Specifically, what are some of the misconceptions associated with medical and performance professionals in the professional sports environment? Or I guess another way of asking that would be, what are some of the logistical and political and maybe even organizational challenges that hinder the ability of someone like you to apply everything that you know?
Douglas, thank you so much for having me on here. First off, to see all the people that you've had on here, and for me to be even in the line of podcasts with them is a tremendous honor. In terms of my background, I am a physical therapist, a strength coach, writer. I think that's about it for right now. And I've been a PT for 6 years now, 5-6 years, somewhere around there. And I've worked in pro sports for about 2 years. And now I'm back in clinic work. And in terms of your question regarding the challenges of working in pro sports, especially in a person of my position where I have played both roles of, various roles, but of a physical therapist, of a strength coach, of a nutrition guy, of a sports science, just worn a lot of hats. I think the biggest challenge that you have to understand going in, especially if you've never worked in pro sports, at least in basketball, because that's the only thing I can attest to, is what the goal is of you being there and the goal of the organization. And the goal of the organization is to win at all costs. And sometimes that can go against things that maybe you have done or some of the beliefs that you have as a practitioner or a strength coach who didn't work in this setting. For example, if we go back to physical therapists, the Hippocratic Oath states very clearly to do no harm. And in this environment, that may have to be pushed aside sometimes. And I'll give you an example. What if the individual hurt himself and would continue to hurt himself by playing in this next game? But if he doesn't play, there's a good chance that we lose and we get booted out of the playoffs, or we don't make the playoffs, or we lose a very important game. Well, in that scenario, we are most certainly doing harm to this individual, but that harm is only a means to the goal of winning. Or another example could be, well, what if a guy's hurt, but if he doesn't play, he may miss out on a big contract. You have to put that individual at risk in order to help him in the long term. So that can be a big challenge. And that was an incredible challenge for me because it's such a shift in mindset when you're working with these individuals. I think also in terms of some other challenges working in pro sports, with that goal of winning, you have a lot of you have a lot of moving parts and individuals involved in trying to achieve that goal. So you have front office people who have certain expectations. You have medical and performance staff that have certain expectations. You have a coaching staff that may have certain expectations. And you have players and their agents that have certain expectations about the way things go. And so when you have so many people throwing their name in the ring, sometimes in some organizations, that can lead to you making sacrifices of what you think is best for an individual. In other organizations, it may be that everyone gets together quite well and you have fewer of those issues. But it's just something you have to understand that's a part of the business, and the need and the desire to win supersedes your ego and what you think oftentimes might be best for an individual. That said, I mean, it's still a phenomenal thing to be a part of. I think I go back and forth on this in terms of how much we as physical therapists, as strength coaches, make a difference, because in pro sports, these guys have made it to the top level for a reason. And it's because they're the best at what they do, and they've clearly done something right to get there. And who am I to say that what this individual is doing is right or wrong? And it really doesn't. We really don't know, because it's hard to say to what extent intervention A, B, or C will impact that person, especially at that high of a level. So I'd say that's probably some of the overarching challenges of working in pro sports. Yeah, and in terms of some of the other questions you had asked, Doug, in terms of logistical, political, organizational challenges, I think they're really the same thing as any big organization. It's because there's a lot of moving parts involved. You have a lot of different individuals contributing, that it can be challenging to be on the same page. And it's just the nature of being a big company. And in terms of political things, it's just like any office. You have to, I don't want to say play the political game, but you just have to be a good person and genuinely interested in the people you're working with, not just the players, but the staff and all that, and give a damn about what's going on, but making sure you do it in a tactful manner.
Yeah, I think it's very refreshing to hear you say that, and I appreciate the humility with which you recognize the very small role that the medical and performance staff actually play in these very complex systems, as it pertains to wins and losses in a professional sporting event. And what also interesting is a lot of times, if you're not familiar with what that environment is really like, it's very easy to be critical of people who work there. So if you see a famous athlete end up on the disabled list with what you think might have been a preventable injury, it's very easy to say, oh, the medical staff must be incompetent, until you realize how many variables actually influence these types of things. And that's something that before I knew people like you, people that I look up to who work in these environments, I was very critical myself. And it's one of those things where, again, it comes down to humility. If you haven't been immersed in that environment, you're not familiar with it, you should probably reserve judgment. It's, let people be innocent until proven guilty, instead of just convicting people without any context. So,
for sure,
before we get into the specifics of your sleep initiative, you've worked both in the NBA and the developmental league, which is essentially the minor leagues of the NBA or professional basketball. And there are some key differences there that I think are important to highlight before we talk about your sleep initiative. I remember in your article you sort of said that the D-League is the most hellacious schedule and kind of lifestyle in professional sports. So could you elaborate a little bit on that and, the primary differences between the D-League and the NBA? Because I think it'll be important when we talk about some of the things you implemented from a sleep standpoint later.
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest difference, and this difference just impacts a lot of things, is money. In pro sports, there are much larger budgets often, and you can give people the best of the best. And so our NBA players, they stayed at the best hotels. They had the best rooms. They had excellent food. They had all of those other ancillary resources filled to the brim. And we also flew private everywhere. We flew charters. And so, you could essentially leave at any time that you want to. And it was like, it makes the still very challenging NBA schedule a little bit more tolerable. But, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but the impact of staying up really late and changing time zones, daily oftentimes can be problematic. Well, what if we take away that money? Then you have the D League. And so there has to be measures where you have to respect that I don't have as much money, but I still have to make some of these travel arrangements. I still have to get these players playing. I still have to do all of these things. And from a travel standpoint, instead of flying charters, we do everything commercial. And based on some of the rules in the D League, for example, if you have a back-to-back, let's say we play a game tonight and then we have a game tomorrow in a different state, you have to take the first flight out that can get you there. And so a lot of times that leads to late nights from a game, especially if there's an overtime, and then an early morning flight, and then you got to do it all over again. And that's just incredibly challenging. A lot of times too, you may be on buses, and if the place is within driving distance, and that has its own challenges as well because you are staying stationary for that amount of a period of time. I think some other challenges that go against the money side of things is these players are not paid well at all. I mean, I forget what the salary structure is, but it's definitely well under $20,000. So, I mean, just looking at the difference between what these guys make and if you just go one tier up, only one, how much more money they make at that level. Other things that I think are challenging for them is how are these players valued? Because they're not the big stakeholders or they're the big investments that the organization has made, a lot of times these guys are more expendable. I mean, if you look at the transaction list in the D League last season, you'll see just people getting waived off of teams immediately and then someone else comes in. Or, a trade happens or someone gets hurt and they're brought back early and get hurt again. Because the risk for these players to not go out and play is so much drastically higher. And another thing, too, that can be challenging is if you have a NBA guy come down to your team, sometimes the entire chemistry and the offense and the way things are coached and run has to change to accommodate for that individual. And that can lead to a lot of frustration and headbutting at times. And I've seen it at several organizations. Other things that are challenging would be the staff size. And so when I was in Memphis, I believe we had six to eight guys on staff, and that's medical and performance. And when I was with the Iowa Energy, or now the Iowa Wolves, we had two. We had me, and I did the medical stuff, I did the performance stuff, I did sports science, I did nutrition, I did travel. So I was wearing 5 hats, which to be everywhere is to be nowhere. So while I learned a lot, I felt like I could only make an impact in certain areas incredibly well, and the rest was kind of just coasting to make sure I satisfied that criteria. And then my other staff member was an athletic trainer, so her scope was limited. So those are a lot of the challenges, and I'm sure there's several more that I'm not thinking of, but it's just it's a different world, man. It really is, especially when you're playing more games than these guys did in college. Granted, it's not at the level of the NBA in terms of the 82 game season. We only play 50 plus playoffs, but to tackle on all these other stressors that are going on is why I think this is one of the most challenging sports leagues you can play in.
Well, it sounds like a pretty incredible experience, albeit an exhausting one, but nothing like being thrown to the fire to really figure out how to get things done. So yeah, basically it sounds like the D-League is kind of doing the NBA on the cheap, which obviously presents a lot of unique challenges. So with that in mind, I wanted to switch gears and talk a little bit about your sleep article, which I'll post in the show notes, because sleep is one of those things where it's very simple but very complicated. So there's all these different new technologies out there and companies trying to market new recovery strategies when we all know that sleep is the best way to help recover from any kind of a physical or emotional stressor, whether you're an executive, you're playing in the NBA. So we know that sleep works, but it's one of those things. It's kind of like nutrition, where because sleep requires people or organizations to modify behaviors, we tend to just forget about it and try to find quicker fixes or hacks. And I thought that your sleep article was probably the most insightful one that I've encountered, because it really prescribes some very practical strategies that are easier to implement than other strategies I've seen advocated. So I guess the first question is, what was your impetus for even starting that sleep initiative? I mean, obviously you must have seen your problems and some problems and thought to yourself, I think that sleep is going to be the fix for some of those things. So what were those problems that you encountered, and why did you think that sleep would help?
Well, the reason for the initiative, Doug, was quite simple. We sucked. I mean, we were the worst team in the D League at that point in time, and we were on a 16-game losing streak. And this was my first exposure to the D League schedule. And I mean, some of the trips that we had, like I'll give you one example of a trip that we had. So we have an appearance at night, 8 o'clock is when it gets over with. And then the following morning, we have to be up at 4 a.m. to catch a 6 a.m. flight to, I think we went to Reno. We went to Reno, which is a 2-hour time zone difference. So you go there. Then the following night, we have a game. The next night after that, we have another 6 a.m. flight. So you figure you got to get up at 4 a.m. again. And this time we're going to San Jose. From San Jose, we drive to Santa Cruz, California, which is about 35 minutes. Then we have a day off, the rest of that day off. Then we have another game the following night in Santa Cruz. And then the worst of the worst was the following night, have a game in Salt Lake City. So you have to get up at 4 a.m. again, drive the 35-minute drive to San Jose, fly out from San Jose, get to Salt Lake, and then play that night. And especially in the beginning of the year, that was happening on a regular basis. And I was doing some subjective questionnaires, and just some of the numbers that these guys would tell me in terms of what they were sleeping was just, it was horrifying. And a lot of times I would get 3 hours or less, or zeros, because I'm going to pull an all-nighter, and because we have an early morning flight, because they stay up late anyways, and you have problems. And our record showed that we had problems because we were on a 16-game losing streak at the time. And I think these problems didn't just affect the players, but it affected myself and the coaching staff. I always joke that, it's a terrible joke, but I always joke that I will probably develop Alzheimer's if I continue on the schedule, because I was getting incredibly forgetful. Just in even simple things. One of my duties was to keep track of fouls and timeouts, and especially early on, I was missing a lot. And I just would have to constantly go back and check because I was sleep deprived. And you can ask some of the coaches that I had worked with that they were feeling similar effects. They would make mistakes. Our players would make mistakes. And it was just an absolute struggle of a season. And so midway through the season, we had a coaching change. And I had at that time accumulated enough data to show that this was a problem to this new coach. And the fact that we had a new coach who seemed fairly receptive, that kind of was my opportunity to say, hey, let's see if we can make some changes and see if this helps our guys. Because if we're calling ourselves a development league, how can we develop if we are not getting sleep? When, if you look at the research, that's when most of the learning occurs and the pruning process of getting rid of extraneous knowledge and motor programs. I mean, you just can't. And so it was those reasons why I knew we had to do something here. And again, and we'll talk about this research at some point, but it was where I knew that given my scope, I could make the most profound impact for the team. And sleep is going to beat out a good strength conditioning program. It's going to destroy a good rehab program. And I would even argue that it's more impactful than a nutrition program.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you say that it's a developmental league. There's not a lot of money on the line here, so it's much more difficult to justify running these guys into the ground from a travel standpoint. And if you're feeling the effects, or the deleterious effects of the lack of sleep, I can only imagine the players who are exerting themselves a lot more and undergoing much more physical stress. So I guess, what measures did you propose? And then to backtrack from your previous answer, what data were you able to present that correlated with this lack of sleep?
So in terms of the data that I was collecting, because this is what led to the changes in the measures, I simply looked at how many hours of sleep these guys would get a night and then how they rated the quality of sleep. And so at the time before I had made these implementations or these suggestions, if you looked at our team average, these guys got 7.1 hours of sleep per night. If you go to Sherry Ma, who's one of the biggest sleep researchers and has a profound following and view and influence on the NBA schedule, she, in her research, I believe, has shown that professional athletes should get in the 9 to 10 range. And so you can see we have a huge disconnect. And moreover, with our guys, if we took out our star sleeper, and this was a guy who would get 8 to 10, like he prioritized sleep, if you took him out of the averages, that number dropped from 7.1 to 6.8 hours of sleep. And so how are you going to be successful when you're sleeping that little? And so some of the measures that I recommended to our coach, who was incredibly receptive, was, first off, we moved practice. So our practice times were at 10 a.m. to start. And if you know how basketball players operate, most of their games are at 7:30 at night, and that's when they need to be at peak alertness levels. And you figure if you get the rise in temperature, body temperature that is, from playing a basketball game, again, if you look at some of the research that James Moss has done, it takes about anywhere from 4 to 6 hours for your body temperature to reach a level that is conducive to sleep. And that's why a lot of individuals advocate for not exercising close to your bedtime. And so if I'm playing a game from 7 to 9:30 or 10 o'clock by the time I'm out of the building, in theory, and it's going to take me 4 to 5 hours to go to sleep, these guys are going to bed after midnight. So it's going to be anywhere from 1 to 3 a.m. in most cases. So you do that, and then you wake them up early. And you are just destroying the amount of sleep that they could even catch up, discounting road games. So we moved practice from 10 to 12 based on just the availability of the gym that we were practicing in. In most cases, I suggested that we eliminate game day shoot-arounds. So it's very traditional that teams, and this is true of the NBA as well, on game day we'll have a shoot-around. One will be at 10 a.m. and then the following team will be at 11 a.m. And we would always take the 10 a.m. slot early on. So I just suggested that we just stop doing those as part of the measure. Another measure I suggested, although this one didn't get followed through much because the flights were booked out, but occasionally it did, was if we were flying somewhere, fly as late as we possibly could, and not like you're doing a red-eye flight, but in the afternoon, and see if you can practice before. And we did the same thing if we were busing somewhere. Ideally, we practiced before we got on the bus, and then we would bus the 3 to 8 hours that we had to travel. If we were busing, I would also recommend that you leave 2 days early. And the reason for that is because when you are sleeping in a new place, and I forget what the name of this phenomenon is called, but when you're sleeping in a new and unfamiliar place, you have an asymmetrical sleep pattern in your brain. And so one hemisphere is more asleep than the other. And in some individuals, this could be complete hemisection in that regard. And so your sleep quality is not as good because you need to have that alertness in case, some sort of threat gets you while you're sleeping. And then that subsides the following day in that area. So if you can leave an extra day earlier, it's more conducive to better sleep. And then there's two others. Another sleep-based initiative that I recommended was after a back-to-back game, if possible, bus to the next place. And if we were busing, try to use a sleeper bus. So for those who don't know what a sleeper bus is, it is what it sounds like. It's a bus that has a bunch of beds in it. I still think the sleep quality is horrible, but it's better than nothing. And so at least these guys could get some sleep on the drive over until we got to our hotel. And then the last thing, which was very critical, I think, for a shift in health that we had, was modulating workouts and practices based on acute to chronic workload measures. So that's another thing that I would look at. I was measuring how much these guys were working, factoring in practices, games, weight training, all that stuff. And because I didn't have much in the way of some of the sports science things that people are using, like Catapult, Stat Sports, or some of the RFID measures, I simply used rating of perceived exertion times the duration of whatever they were doing. And that seemed to be a fairly impactful measure because there's a lot of times where I'd see people go in the red and lo and behold, they would get hurt a week or two later. So those were some of the initiatives that I was able to suggest to our coach based on the data of how long these guys were sleeping and some of the workload measures that we were looking at.
That's really cool. And I think what's most impressive is that you were able to persuade the coaching staff to implement some of these things that kind of fly in the face of some sacred traditions in basketball, like the shoot around. I mean, that's it's like showing up to the ballpark early in baseball. It's something that, just part of the game, and you essentially eliminated these things. So you kind of alluded to it earlier where you presented the coaching staff with some data, but can you just elaborate a little bit more on how you were able to get that buy-in, and was it initially well received, or did it take a lot of persuasion?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, Doug. I think one of the biggest keys, there were several keys to this. I had good relationships with the players, and I think that was probably one of the most impactful things. And before the coach took over, he kind of did some observation to see how things were going. And I gave a damn about these guys. I would give my all in their coaching sessions. I would spend time outside of practice if they needed me, whether it be some type of treatment or just, anything. I mean, I would go to grocery stores with these guys. I would do all the things that they needed to play at their best and be successful. And it was that relationship building, I think, that helped establish some trust with Coach. I also presented a lot of the data that I had talked to you about, but I did it with a caveat. And the way I brought it to his attention in terms of making these suggestions was this. And I told him, I say, Coach, what if I told you I had a method that could improve the team's free throw and 3-point percentage by 9% apiece. Would you be for that? Now, any coach in their right mind would say, well, hey, yes, I want to do that, right? I mean, that's a significant change in scoring. I mean, that makes Shaquille O'Neal a respectable free throw shooter, right? And so I told him what that thing was, and it was sleep. And there's a study that Sherry Ma did. Again, I will refer you guys to her, and we can she's got a talk on like the Gatorade Sports Science thing, which I think would be good in your show notes. But she did a study with Stanford basketball where she forced the team to sleep an extended period of time, and I think it was like 10 plus hours. And if you weren't tired, you still stayed in bed. And after she had done that for a period of time, that was the exact change in their free throw and 3-point percentage, which there's no drill, there's no exercise, there's no piece of food that can have such a profound impact on performance. And if the goal is to win, you need to do everything in your power to do that. And having that 9% difference would be huge. And of course he said, well, yes, I would like to know that. And then I presented all the sleep data. And then we just kind of talked through what would be reasonable, what wouldn't be reasonable based on some of the logistical things that can happen. And we implemented a lot of these things along with some other measures. I mean, we were also feeding these guys a lot more, which was good, giving them good quality food and modulating the workload. And he was all for it. And we got some really nice changes from implementing that.
Yeah, I love the blend of objective and subjective measures. You're able to present the coach with some pretty hard data showing the impact of sleep deprivation on sport-specific performance, but at the same time, you're also gleaning a lot of valuable information from subjective questionnaires. So it's one of those things where we can't quantify everything, and we still have to rely on intuition and personal relationships to a degree. But the things that we can quantify pretty well, we should use those things and implement them appropriately. So I think that really speaks to your ability to just take all the information in and use it appropriately. So you come up with these proposed measures, you get buy-in from the coaching staff. So once you implemented this stuff for a while, what changes did you observe in individual and team performance?
Yeah. Well, let's look at what happened. Because we implemented these measures, and we had to first, of course, measure, did we make a positive change? And so what we looked at as a post-mortem on the season was the number of nights that players would sleep less than 6 hours, because it seemed like that was the number that was most impactful. And I have to give kudos to the sports science guys in Memphis, because they were able to compile some of this data together and present this to me. And so before the coaching change and the initiatives that we presented, 12% of the time our players would sleep less than 6 hours a night. As soon as we made that shift, and once we looked at the remainder of the season that those initiatives were put in place, we dropped that down to 1% for 80% of our players. We had a couple guys who just were not big sleepers, regardless of what you would do, and didn't have anything to do with the schedule. I mean, I think I would argue that he had a sleep disorder. So that was a phenomenal change. But okay, does that help us with the goal of winning? And the answer was a resounding yes, because when we implemented these initiatives and we had a game involved. Now, granted, put this into perspective, because it's not like this amazing record and we won the championship, because we were still kind of crappy. But we went 7-6 compared to, I think we were 2-18 before the initiatives took place. But we went 7-6 once those took place, with 5 of those wins against winning teams, which, again, for the worst team in the league, that's pretty darn respectable. And now a lot of individuals might say, well, maybe it was the coaching change that. And I have no doubt that had an impact. But here's what I want you to consider, because there were also times that we didn't use these measures and these initiatives for whatever reason. And when that happened, we were 2-9 with only one win against a winning record team. So the fact that we made just one small change, or we at least focused on one goal, and that was prioritizing sleep whenever we could, we led to some profound objective effects. From a subjective standpoint, things that I noticed were the team had just so much more energy in practice and games. I mean, we had one of the wildest benches, and I can't tell you how many times the D-League refs would tell us to sit down or tee us up. And it's not because we were, being asses, but it was because we were just that crazy. That was huge. I think irritability of everyone involved was just much, much lower. We would have players arguing with one another, getting in fights, and you just didn't see that. I mean, we'd have coaches just, appear frustrated for a multitude of reasons, and that just didn't happen. I also think the amount of mistakes that we made were much less. Now, I noticed that, like in myself personally, I was much more on point with fouls and timeout situations, but even the coaches made better decisions, and the players made better decisions. I mean, there would be a lot of bonehead plays that our team would make, especially in the second half. And we'd always have like this little stretch where, the shit would hit the fan essentially, and we would just start playing poorly. And that happened much, much, much less frequently. The team played more like a team as opposed to a group of individuals. So they were moving the ball, sharing the ball, and I mean, we got so many compliments when we were at the D-League Showcase, which was in Toronto, where basically all the D-League teams come and play against one another, and you have all these NBA scouts watching them play. And it was after that we had a lot of people get called up and get NBA contracts, which is great. And I think the last thing was during that second half of the season, we had way fewer injuries. I mean, we had so many major injuries, which I think a contributing factor was fatigue. And that's not just from sleep deprivation, but also playing a lot of games and practicing hard. And all of that stuff, I mean, it was like a complete 180 shift. And it was really, really cool to see. And I'd like to think that the sleep measures played some semblance of a role in creating that shift.
Yeah, and if we're going to be cynics, we could say that this is not a controlled study. You changed or you modified other interventions besides sleep, but we do have the empirical data to suggest that sleep is really important. And what you implemented didn't really violate anything from a theoretical or even an empirical standpoint. So it's like, and you got a good result. So to me, it seems logical that other teams should be implementing similar measures, despite the fact that we can certainly not say with 100% certainty that this is what you did was causative. But I think it makes theoretical and to a certain degree some empirical sense as well, even though what you did couldn't be controlled for in a more scientific type way. So I think that what you did was very positive, and other teams should take note. And I think another thing that's cool is that from working in that environment how difficult it can be to elicit behavioral changes. And it seems like your sleep initiative emphasized modifying organizational behavior over that of the individual athletes. So do you think that sometimes people like us in our field, the performance of the medical people, try too hard to get athletes to conform to how we'd like things to be, as opposed to accepting the reality? So in other words, there's this kind of mentality that players need to be disciplined, the whole rise and grind thing, get up really early so you can go to your early practice or get your weight room work in before practice. When in order to do that and be productive, players presumably need to go to bed at a reasonable hour. We know that a lot of these players are night owls, so we can focus on ourselves and say, you guys need to go to bed earlier, or we can accept the reality these guys are going to go to bed late and do things like move practice to later in the day, cancel or have these morning shoot-arounds less frequently. So it puts much more of a burden on the organization, the coaching staff, and the front office than it does the player. but at the end it seems like you got a superior result. So do you think that sometimes we tend to be a little bit too paternalistic when it comes to this kind of stuff instead of being a little bit more realistic?
It's a great question, Doug. And I think the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle, because, and I'll give you an example. Let's say we have a heroin addict and we have, rehabilitated him to the nth degree, and he's done all the right things, and then all of a sudden he goes back to the same town that he lives in and hangs out with the same people. Well, he's inevitably going to relapse at some point. And that's because what we didn't account for was the environment that individual is going in. And even if you try to do all of these favorable things and educate and try to change behavior, if the environment is not conducive to allowing you to do that, you're going to fail. And I think that's where we were at this point. One is the environment of the D-League and the environment of the NBA doesn't necessarily condone or allow an individual to adapt those favorable changes. So you have to account for the reality of that. And it's easier to implement a change in someone if it requires low effort on their part. And this is true of any task, because we have the wonderful thing called decision fatigue to take into account. That's why when an individual tries to make sweeping changes in their health and wellness, it might last for a week or two, and then all of a sudden, well, crap, it's just too many things to do, and then I go off the wagon, so to speak, and I lose. And so anything you can do to make that easier is critical. And I mean, there's a guy who I really respect, who's a good friend of both of ours, Mike Roussel, and he's educated me a lot on the idea of scripting meals. And basically what that is taking choice out of the equation and just saying, hey, here's your meal, eat this. And it's much easier for you then to apply a nutritional intervention when it's done that way, assuming that the food is palatable for the individual. Well, I think that's something that when we are trying to establish behavior change, we don't do enough of. And that's just making it easier for these guys to make changes. Now, that said, I think, too, another thing we have to consider is if we're trying to elicit behavior change, how much time do we have? In the D-League and the NBA, we need to win now. And we're not going to have time to try to convince player X to get blue light blockers and go to bed earlier and make sure that you do all of these other things to be successful, especially if that individual has come from a background and environment where that's not valued, or eating good food is not valued. It's much easier to, well, one, get good people in your organization who already have those habits, or two, implement things that make the transition towards behaviors that are conducive of winning to be successful. I think it's different in the setting that you and I work in, Doug, and that's because we have less of a time crunch, in the sense that it's low pressure for us to make a positive change. And so if we're trying to get our clients to go to bed earlier, well, we can spend a heck of a lot more time educating them on that. And there's not necessarily an impetus for them to do that, unless it's something that is incredibly salient to them. And maybe that's, look, you're performing like crap at work, and when you don't sleep, you hurt more. Like, we need to change this now, otherwise we're not going to be successful. And so I think in our setting, we need to try to elicit behavior change while still making it easier, and continual reinforcement. But not only that, but giving our patients and our clients the accountability and selection of what those behaviors ought to be changed. And I think if we can have our people that we work with be accountable for their actions and own whatever changes they're trying to implement in their lives that are favorable, you're ultimately going to be more successful. And I think sometime too, that's probably another negative aspect of the professional sports system is a lot of these players have a tremendous amount of power. And I think that a lot of organizations are afraid to hold these guys accountable. But regardless of the amount of power that they have, they're still having a job. Like, it's still a job for them. And if they are doing things that are deleterious to the organizational's goals, well, they need to be held accountable for that. And I think that's something that perhaps implementing behavior change as an example could be a way of establishing that accountability. So with all of that said, I think that we have to do everything in our power to make sure that the individuals that we are working with are establishing good habits and good behaviors, not just because it's going to help us achieve our goals, but I think it's better for the health of the population. Because if we can get everyone to sleep more and just eat a little bit healthier, it transcends basketball games. And so anything we can do in our power to make that transition easier for who we work with, whether that's setting up the environment in such a manner that they can be more successful and continually educating them, then it's going to be beneficial in the long run.
No, I love that answer because it's so nuanced. It seems like you're suggesting that we need to hold people accountable for their own development, but where possible, manipulate the environment and minimize the degrees of freedom so that we don't have to ask for as much behavioral change. It's kind of like reaching a middle ground, which is what it always seems to come down to. And that's pretty much the gist of every single one of these episodes, is trying to meet somewhere in the middle and avoid the extremes. So again, I thought that was a very insightful answer. You've referenced Sherry Ma quite a few times. So besides, her research, is there any other resources that you recommend that really helped influence your perspective and emphasis on sleep?
For sure, yeah. You definitely want to hit up Sherry Ma. I think she is the guru. I don't want to say the guru, but the guru of sleep scheduling. There's a few other books that I really were incredibly impactful for me, and there's several more, but I just haven't vetted them yet, so I don't want to give them to your listeners. But James Moss, the book is Sleep for Success. It's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of written funny. It's kind of written somewhat gimmicky in a way, but like, he's just got so many practical tips on how to make your sleep environment better, improving sleep. Just all facets of sleep. Another guy who I really like, I would say he's a little bit more out there in some of the recommendations that I've heard, is Sean Stephenson. And he wrote a book called Sleep Smarter. And there's some of the things that he's talked about have kind of blown me away. Like talking about using earthing mats and how the polarity of the environments that we are contacting that can have an influence on sleep. But he also goes really in depth into circadian rhythms, which is really, really cool. But also at the same time giving a lot of practical tips on how to improve sleep. Following on the circadian rhythm point, I am really kind of getting into Rhonda Patrick stuff. And she's interviewing a lot of individuals on just the use of circadian rhythms in terms of meal timing. And so, we think of circadian rhythms as like just focusing on sunlight and making sure you block blue light and all these other things. But there's so many other influences that can impact your circadian rhythms and your ability to sleep. And one circadian cue that we don't think about often is food. And when you consume a meal, there is a decrease in melatonin production, which is going to inhibit sleep. So she's actually done some research, and I think Sachin Panda is the guy or at least exposed me to research. I think Sachin Panda is the guy who does this research, but he's shown that eating your meals earlier in the day, as an example, can influence not just sleep, but body composition favorably. And so there's many other influences, and I'm sure there's other influences that I'm not aware of that can impact sleep favorably. The last one that I would probably recommend to people is this book called Take a Nap, Change Your Life by Mark Ehrman. And this is something Mike Roussel turned me on to. But like this cat gets so in-depth scientifically in terms of napping and how a lot of it is based on circadian rhythms and what time you wake up. Because while we can say we're night owls or we're larks or we're all these chronotypes, we have this problem of the sun that's always going to influence wake cycles. And so how can we manipulate that variable in particular via napping? And so depending on what time of day you nap, that can influence what percentage of that time is spent in a specific sleep cycle. And for example, if you take a nap earlier in the day, you're going to be more likely to have a higher percentage of REM sleep during that nap, which can have different impacts on, say, creativity and learning and all of these other things, and some of the pruning impacts that occurs via the glial cells. Whereas if you take a nap later in the day, you have a greater preponderance of being in deep sleep. And that has different effects, such as, muscle and tissue repair and recovery, and among other things. And Mark does a great job of helping you decide where that sweet spot is, depending on what your goals are, where you can either be very REM heavy in your nap, you can be very deep sleep heavy in your nap, or you can be somewhere in the middle. And then he also talks about some of the benefits of what light sleep do. So that's just a phenomenal read. And I would say those have been kind of some of the most impactful for me at this point. I know Charles Czeisler has a book, and he's also a big researcher in terms of sleep, that he would be another guy to possibly look at.
Yeah, it's a pretty long list, and you didn't even allude to some other evening behaviors that might positively affect sleep, but we'll keep that for a different episode. We try to keep it classy here until we have the hard data. But,
indeed, Douglas, indeed.
Anyway, so you're really active with blogging and social media. You put out a lot of great information. How can the audience members here learn a little bit about your work?
Sure. So my baby is my website, and that's zachcupples.com. Just my name, straight up, zachcupples.com. I try to put out a blog post every Monday. I've been pretty darn consistent with it. So I do that on Mondays. And if you sign up for my newsletter, you can get privy to any new things that I put out much earlier than any other medium. And if you guys are into acute chronic workload ratios, I have a calculator that you can calculate those with. And I'll tell you what, I've been doing that a lot more with my patients and clients online. Has been pretty impactful. So you can follow me on my website. I'm also on the Facebooks, and that's /ZCouples. On Wednesdays at 8:30 Central Standard Time, I do a live show called the Movement Debrief, where I just talk about not random stuff, but whatever I'm reflecting on that I think would be impactful for you guys. So that's Facebook. My Twitter handle is ZCouples. I'm on there periodically. I also Instagram. I'm getting into that. That's a kind of a mix of some professional and personal stuff. And my Instagram handle is just my name, Zach Cupples. And of course, you can also find me on YouTube if you just search Zach Cupples. Those are probably all the ways you can get a hold of me. If you have a question, comment, concern, or complaint, you can email me. And I'm sure I put that in the show notes. But my email is Cupples, my last name, performance@gmail.com. Otherwise, if you're in lovely Page, Arizona, where I'm currently a physical therapy mercenary, a.k.a. a travel physical therapist, come see me, and we'll go hike and get some food.
Well, you put out a lot of great information, and today was no exception. So thanks so much again for your time.
Thank you, Douglas, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Appreciate it.
Take care.